Power creep is a term used to describe the gradual unbalancing of a game due to successive releases of new content, leaving older content underpowered or irrelevant as time goes on. Throughout the video game industry's existence, now spanning over half a century, power creep has often been thought of as its grim reaper, something terrible yet tragically unavoidable for most if not all running updating games. If not that, then a similar concept known as feature creep, a tendency of a design project or product cycle to accumulate more and more features or details that through one way or another dilutes or overcomplicates a game's essential experience. Every title that receives frequent updates or patches will one day suffer from either or both outcomes sooner or later, and for Genshin that scenario is starting to become more and more apparent. But that in and of itself may not necessarily be a bad thing. With the recent addition of Yelan, a lot of discussion has been thrown around on whether she's a quote-unquote 5-star version of Shinto, who has been one of the most accessible and powerful supports ever since the game's release. And while that was an incredibly premature assumption based on leaks, from a fundamental standpoint, the idea that such a question is even brought up has led me to work on this video. Does Yelan's introduction signal Genshin Impact experiencing power creep within its roster? Let's find out. Understanding power creep is difficult in light of its definition changing based on circumstances or how the game is formatted, but for RPGs, the proof is in the pudding. Gachas are notoriously vulnerable to power creep as well. Those of you who play other titles may be well aware of this. Due to their inherent business model, in order for new units, weapons, what have you to be desirable for players, they would have to have an incentive or some special property that makes them more effective or efficient than whatever players already have. For example, let's say you have a 200 attack sword, you've been using it for a while and so far it's never let you down. A new update comes out with an event banner featuring a 200 attack sword, but you already have one, so there's no incentive to go after it. That would be a different story if the event weapon was a 200 attack sword that dealt bonus damage against pyro-type enemies. To push on the sense of necessity, gachas usually introduce new content alongside that new obtainable weapon or character that they're effective against. So in this instance, the event dungeon release with the new pyro-killing sword is full of pyro-type enemies. And the longer a game runs, the more they'll have to keep doing this because that's really the only way they can get players to go after new stuff. Personal attachment factors like appearance or likability do play a major part in whether or not people want to go after them, as they say waifu or husbando over meta, but ultimately for a new character to be commercially successful, they need the practical benefits in conjunction with personality. It's no coincidence that some of Genshin's most popular characters are also the strongest. Kaedehara Kazuha was effectively disregarded as a more expensive version of Sucrose while having an almost comical resemblance to Aether in appearance. Shortly after though, it was made very clear just how ridiculously strong and consistent he was. People have been begging for Hoyo to announce his return for months now. Consequently, this means that if a gacha title wishes to maintain its monetary success, any new character release would have to offer something that is either not present within the available roster or better. And the unfortunate part of this is that either approach leads to the eventual downfall of a game. If you try to circumvent power creep by giving new content different stuff instead of better stuff, it's going to require more systems to be added, especially if you're trying to incorporate new mechanics, resulting in feature creep. However long it takes to get to a point where you hit that wall and start having to move the goalpost depends entirely on what you had to start with, something you may remember me bringing up in my hybrid scaling video. From the looks of it, Hoyo seems to be doing a bit of both. With every new 5-star character introduced, they're not going out of their way to make new units blatantly stronger than other ones, rather have skills that can apply to more scenarios on top of the gradual increase in power or efficiency. An early instance of this was Diluc and Hu Tao. If we go by sheer force, there's very little chance the former has over the latter. Another would be Eula, who is for all intents and purposes a strict upgrade over Razor as the best physical damage dealer, not that there was really any competition to begin with. I suppose you could make a case for Kokomi overshadowing Barbara in almost every way as well, and most if not all of Chongyu's practical utility is outstripped by Shenhe if we break it down to sheer numbers. But the reason I waited until Yelan's release before making this video is partly because I wanted to see how things would pan out. I had this in my list of ideas ever since Shinhe, but I decided to rain check on it. Unlike the previous examples, besides maybe Venti, Xingqiu's reputation is legendary. Next to Bennett and Xiangling, he's one of the founding members of the national team, the most cost-effective team composition in the game to this day. Further strengthened with the advent of Raiden Shogun, the way he can effortlessly chain Hydro reactions and supplement his team's damage has made him arguably the strongest non-5-star character in Genshin, or at the very least tied with Bennett, though they serve different purposes. Interestingly enough, even as the Hydra roster has been expanding with the addition of very powerful 5-stars like Kokomi and Ayato, Xingqiu's relevance has not diminished whatsoever. That might change now that Yelan's here. Kokomi, Ito, Eula, and even Shenhe's releases weren't particularly noted for pushing the envelope on progression of power in this game, considering their supposed counterparts Barbara, Noelle, Razor, and Chongyun weren't exactly known for standing above everyone else. So when you have Shinto, widely thought of as a top-tier unit, and release a 5-star version similar to him, it's not unreasonable as to why preconceptions would suggest Yelan is power creep in the game. First, we should probably go through Shinto and Yelan's individual kits to see where the similarities are. Shinto's elemental skill Fatal Rain Screen performs 2 consecutive Hydro attacks, spawning rain swords that grant the active user super armor and damage reduction as well as Hydro status on cast. Activating Rain Cutter causes the rain swords to strike in tandem with the active user's normal attacks, dealing a substantial amount of Hydro damage in total. With Constellations and passive talents, his rain swords heal for a small amount and shred enemy Hydro resistance by 15%. Despite its elementary function, Shinto's combination of offense and defense enhancers coupled by his ability to share it with the rest of his team is what makes him so effective. Hydro as an element is part of 2 of the best reactions in the game, Vaporize and Freeze. Rain Cutter automatically transforms any pyro or cryo damage dealer into a one-man Vaporize or Freeze reactor, and if you remember, for most of early 2021 we had nothing but cryo and pyro units. As for Yelan, her moveset is more complex. Lingering Lifeline has press and hold variants. Pressing the key causes her to dash forward, damaging all enemies in a straight line. Holding it grants her an immense surge of movement speed. During this time, she gains super armor and tags anyone she collides with. After ending the skill, anyone tagged suffers massive Hydro damage and is pulled towards Yelan's position. It should be noted that the hold version does not count as a sprint contrary to its animation, implying that you can also use Lingering Lifeline to move around faster at no cost to your stamina that might be needed for charge attacks or for basic travel. Also, according to a helpful Reddit post made by King of Chicken 96, I love the name by the way, Yelan is entirely incorporeal during this time, giving her the ability to phase through enemies and enemy structures like ice or glass cages. This attack also doesn't apply wet status the way previous Hydro skills do. Ordinarily, applying elemental status to yourself isn't a bad thing, but wet status does leave you exposed to getting frozen. For her elemental burst, Death Clarion Dice is an explosion of Hydro damage in a large area around her, very standard for a 5-star. Furthermore, she instantiates Exquisite Throw, a singularity that follows the active party member and attacks in conjunction with your normal hits, similarly to Cleese. Only hers remains active when swapping out, and the damage scales offer maximum health. One more thing, with the help of her passive talent Adapt with Ease, while Exquisite Throw is in effect, the active user gains a ramping unconditional damage boost of up to 50% over the course of the duration, which averages out to about a 30% damage boost across the board. Just flat out no strings attached bonus damage. Insane. Shinto and Yelan both have an elemental burst entailing some semblance of a follow-up attack, which partially explains why everyone had the impression that she's a better version of him. But let's get into the differences in their playstyles. For one, Yelan scales with HP while Shinto scales with regular attack. This may sound like a positive in light of the benefits of hybrid scaling as well as the ever-frequent HP artifacts we find ourselves with, but this also means you can't augment Yelan's damage with attack buffs in the same fashion since Exquisite Throw's damage is exclusively based on her HP, and as of right now we have no other characters that artificially increase max health, or rather no one besides her. Secondly, she forfeits any defense boost in favor of pure offense. While Shinto has a few perks like super armor, damage reduction, and a little bit of healing, Yelan prefers to gamble on raw damage. And thirdly, from what I've seen, Yelan's Hydro application is slightly less consistent than Shinto's, but not to an extent where it's unreliable. In essence, if defensive utility is not a priority, Yelan can effectively replace Shinto in any composition the latter would be suitable in, and vastly outperform him in the damage department. Though if you're trying to sustain your team, then Shinto is the more reliable choice. Therein lies the problem. Genshin Impact's current dungeons, bosses, and challenges do not inflict so much damage that it demands you to compose your entire party around survivability. Therefore, if we measure a unit's effectiveness solely on how well they contribute to your damage output, then Yelan is invariably stronger than Shinto. There's no existing situation in this game where he would be the superior choice. Now, an argument can be made for Yelan having every right to be Shinto's better given that she's a 5-star unit, but circumstantially, Shinto is better than some 5-stars. Creating a unit even stronger than him is a very clear sign of power creep. That is, if it were any other gacha game. Genshin's a little different. Power creep at its basis form is largely relative. There's no hard line in the sand declaring when a game has gone too far. Some might say when damage numbers get too high or stats become heavily overinflated, but that's still an arbitrary metric that has no intrinsic value. To measure power creep, you have to look at comparisons, how strong a character is relative to the ones preceding it. It's true that for a game to continue keeping players entertained, it would have to introduce content and subsequent rewards that are better or more versatile than what is already available. Otherwise, players won't see a reason to go after it. But how much stronger is left up to the developers of each game. As a parallel, I want to bring up Realm of the Mad God. It's a bullet hell game I used to play a lot when I was younger. In Fallout 2020, a new endgame dungeon was added featuring 5 new bosses, each with their own set of droppable loot. At the time, those items were significantly better than the game's prior best in slot equipment. However, they weren't so much better to the point where said prior equips were no longer viable. In fact, you could still take on all of the game's content with Wine Cellar Tops, a set of items that were considered best in slot way back in, I would say, 2016. So while the advent of new endgame loot is technically power creeping the game, the gear treadmill progresses at such a snail pace that you can quit the game and probably still have relevant stuff 5 years later. Gacha games are infamous for having very fast gear treadmills. You'd be lucky for your characters and equips to not be rendered obsolete within 6 months at best. Brave Frontier, Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, Fire Emblem Heroes, just to name a few. Take a break for 3 weeks and there's a chance your best character is only half as strong as whatever new came out. When FFBE started in late 2016, being able to dish out over 100,000 in damage was the stuff of dreams, and having an attack stat of over 600 was considered godlike. By 2018, the new goal was 10 million, and most units were chilling at around 2,500 attack, maybe more. By 2020, the damage ceiling has reached into the billions with stats of over 4,000, and then in mid-2021 when it quit, the numbers were so big they couldn't even fit on the damn screen. It got to a point where every single week, that week's character was 1.5 times stronger than the one that came before, and I'm not exaggerating. That's not really the case for Genshin though. Mind you, power creep indisputably exists in this game. Chances are if you played Genshin for the first 2 or 3 months and then played again now, you would have some catching up to do. But there are two sides to this equation: the means to complete the game's content, and of course, the content itself. The game's difficulty is advancing far slower than the pace at which its characters grow stronger. Units like Shogun, Kazuha, Ayaka, and now Yelan have certainly moved the goalposts to where previous big names like Diluc and Keqing have seen better days. But there's a reason why if you take a look at most tier lists, more than 90% of the roster is in A tier or above. Everyone's viable. The hardest dungeon in this game is Spiral Abyss, and even that doesn't pose much of a challenge these days. Yelan is strong, very strong, but she isn't necessary, combat-wise anyway. I would argue the best thing about her is her lingering lifeline. It makes her run twice as fast as a sprint without costing stamina, allowing you to basically sprint forever. The only stipulation is that you can't jump, but I mean for that speed it's a worthwhile trade-off. I digress though. She's stronger, but Shinto can still handle any scenario she can. The only reason you would have to pull for her is if you don't have Shinto, and I'd be very surprised if you didn't, or if you really like her as a character. Moreover, there's no rule in Genshin that says you can only use one Hydro character in a party. In fact, Shinto and Yelan synergize famously. If you have both, feel free to use both, then you can super buff any Cryo or Pyro DPS you want even further. If anything, her addition to Genshin's roster is nothing but a good thing. The game was designed in a way so that you can have a lot of characters that reach the same destination more or less, but go about it in their own ways, thus creating more variety for players if they're bored of one character. But that being said, the blade cuts both ways. Since there's no content that challenges you enough to optimize and strategize a cohesive and specific team, it also means there's no reason for you to do anything other than the bare minimum, and that's where power creep might be of concern. Backtracking to what I said at the beginning, there's no incentive for players to go after new content if what they already have is perfectly fine. While it has the positive consequence of not feeling pressured to chase after whatever is flavor of the month all the time, it has the negative consequence of discouraging variety among the general player base. If Yelan is so much better in damage than any other Hydro unit, there would be no reason for you to want to try out other characters like Mona, Kokomi, Ayato, and so on, as there aren't any situations where the others will be better for your success. There are tons of really fun characters with engaging gameplay and interesting playstyles that I'm sure the developers spent a lot of time crafting and designing, but there's no obligation, no reason for you to use them. In my Why No One Plays series, a common problem you'll notice is that the characters aren't bad per se. There's just nothing they do that someone else can't do better, even if what they do is unique only to them, because there's no content in the game that specifically demands that kind of role. Bosses in dungeons remind me of Sword Art Online's bosses. They all take place in the wide room with no strategy other than repeatedly smacking away at mobs until they die. Essentially, all you have to do is assemble a party full of damage, and then you win. In a strange way, power creep simultaneously has no effect and every effect on Genshin Impact. For some, that might be seen as a good thing. For others, it might be part of why the experience has been getting more and more dull over time. What about you guys? Do you believe it's affecting the game's future for better or for worse? Let me know in the comments down below. But that's it for today. If you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, join my Discord server, and feel free to watch my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. For now though, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.